talking about national movements and political violence today. How did you get interested in this topic?
Yeah, so I've always been very interested in Middle East politics in particular, as well as political violence. When I was a graduate student at MIT, I started to do some exploratory fieldwork in the region, interviewing members of the Zionist movement, of the Palestinian national movement, and I realized that there was so much of a story here in terms of the internal politics of these movements and what impact that had on the effectiveness of the movement. And that might seem to be quite natural, but the way the literature is written, a lot of people look at why some movements succeed and other movements fail, but they look at it as the movement being a unitary whole where, the movement does this or the movement does that, as if all the actors are working in concert, whereas in reality, of course, sometimes there's fragmentation, there's groups competing against one another to become leaders of the movement. And so from that exploratory fieldwork, I realized this is maybe where the key story is, and so I wanted to write both an article and a broader book looking at when and why national movements are successful, but focusing particularly on the internal politics of those movements.
How does this article connect to the classes you teach at Boston College?
When I started this, it connected directly to two classes that I teach. One is I teach international relations of the Middle East. In the course of that class, we look in depth at national movements in the Middle East over time. We look at the Palestinian Zionist national movements. We also look at the Algerian national movement, Tunisia, a number of different states in the Middle East and North Africa, as well as looking at things like pushes towards democratization and regime change amidst the Arab Spring. So this whole idea of kind of national movements or political movements and revolutions and insurgencies, it's a key part of the course in terms of the regional focus and the historical focus. I also teach a class on terrorism, insurgency, and political violence, and that kind of focuses more on the tactical side of things. And in that class, I look a lot at, what causes violence? Why do some groups opt for nonviolent civil resistance and other groups opt for violent resistance or violent attacks? So in many ways, the theories that I'm looking at in this project connect directly to the types of things I'm teaching in that class. This semester, I've actually gone even a step beyond that, and I actually have a class designed directly around this project. So I have actually 15 research assistants who are helping me to analyze 4 particular national movements: the Zionist, Palestinian, Algerian, and Irish national movements, about 3 or 4 students on each one. And what they are doing is, for the class, we meet once a week and we talk about backgrounds on various research tasks and how to do archival work and things of this nature. But then the majority of their work for the class is actually doing research on these movements. So going and reading archives or reading interviews or breaking down secondary sources or listening to interviews that I've conducted with members from these movements and analyzing them for the various questions that we're looking at. Why did this group decide to use violence here but not here? Why was the movement effective here but not here? What were the demands of these groups during this period but not during that period? They're helping me to analyze that stuff, which is helping the broader project, the broader book project, but at the same time, I think they're getting a lot of great kind of hands-on research in a serious research project. That's not just something they're doing for a semester, it's contributing to publications. In fact, this article that we're talking about today, the international security article, one of the RAs who's working with me this semester has been working with me for a couple semesters previous. He's thanked in the article, and his research on the Algerian national movement contributed directly to the article. So I try to make my classes, integrate extensively with my research. I find it benefits, my research projects as well as the students themselves.
The central questions of your article are: when and why do national movements succeed? What explains variation in the use and effectiveness of political violence employed by nationalist groups?
I think the key factor for both the behavior of groups as well as the effectiveness of movements is the internal balance of power. So basically, is power very concentrated inside a movement with just one single dominant group, a hegemon, or is it distributed and fragmented amongst many different groups? If you have a national movement in which there's a hegemon, in which power is concentrated with one dominant faction, I argue that that movement is much more likely to be successful, to be effective, for a couple of reasons. First and foremost, that group has the incentive to pursue the common goal of statehood, even for its own selfish ends. The idea being that in a movement where you have collective action, you have everyone wants this common goal, but then at the same time, everyone benefits from that goal being achieved, so they all have incentives to free ride. If you have a hegemon, that group will push for the common goal because it also gets certain selective benefits along the way. It gets to form a new government, it gets the status of being the leader in the movement, it gets tax revenues, all of these types of things. So what's good for that group is also good for the broader movement. If you have a fragmented movement with lots of different groups, what happens is every group's going to focus on their own selfish ends, fighting against other groups or pursuing their own organizational goals, but not put as much effort or resources into that common objective. So that's the first reason national movements are less successful when power is distributed or fragmented. Secondly, you can get groups when they compete against one another, not just saying, oh, I'll do this, I'll do that, like in a political debate. They'll often use violence against one another as well. So they'll do infighting, or they'll chain gang, which is a version of attacking the state but trying to pull the broader movement into a conflict for which it's not yet ready. These types of internal fighting dynamics are actually counterproductive for the movement. You're less likely to see that when there's a hegemon, because no one can really challenge the hegemon for leadership, but also if the hegemon cracks down internally, it'll end infighting quite quickly. Whereas if you have a number of different groups who are roughly equal in power, infighting can go on for a long time, chain gang can be successful, and ultimately groups are moving up and down the ladder, but the broader movement is being unsuccessful. Finally, in terms of signaling, if you think about a national movement, it needs to tell a foreign population or the current government what it wants, what it's willing to give up, when it's willing to actually start or stop violence. If you have a dominant group, a hegemon, they're much more credible and clear in both their demands and their ability to deliver on them. If you have multiple groups who are making different types of demands, one group is signing a deal, another one is spoiling it and continuing to launch violence, then generally you're going to have a less successful national movement. So at the end of the day, concentrated power, a single dominant group, generally leads to success. Fragmented power, multiple groups, leads to failure. Now quickly, in terms of which groups are actually using violence or not and explaining behavior, the distribution of power also explains that. So if you think about a fragmented movement with multiple groups that are, each have power, but there still is a hierarchy. There's some groups who have more members than others, more weapons than others, etc. My article argues that if you're number 2 or number 3, you're kind of in a challenger position. You're going to have incentives to try to shake up the game, do something different in terms of getting notoriety for your group, potentially taking more risks, and so those groups are most likely to use violence and instigate violence. Whereas the leading group, even though they're not a hegemon, they still kind of want to maintain the status quo internally. They're still in line to kind of inherit the throne if the movement's successful. They also know that if the state cracks down on the movement for launching violent attacks, that top group is the most likely to get targeted because the state sees that top group as a threat, but they also often have better intelligence on that strongest group. So they know even if they're not the ones who initiate violence, it's the weaker groups on the bottom who are doing so. The top group is going to bear the brunt of the repression. Therefore, they're often likely to clamp down on groups within their own movement trying to stop violence, not just for the broader good, but for their own personal organizational good.
Your article analyzes the Palestinian and Algerian national movements in the 20th century. How do these cases support your theory?
Yeah, great question. So what I decided to do with the article was look at two movements over time. So basically looking for variation when you have groups changing positions. Some of them are becoming number 1, number 2, number 3 in the movement. At various periods, power is very concentrated. Other times it's dispersed. And they've also met with varying outcomes. There is a state of Algeria today. After a long struggle, the Algerian national movement was successful. There is not officially a state of Palestine today. So the Palestinian national movement has not been as successful, although they certainly have had periods of greater failure and success. So I decided to look at these cases because they have nice variation on both my independent and dependent variables. I wanted to look at why exactly is that happening? Why in some periods are they more or less successful? What I find is that, again, the distribution of power plays a key role here. So you look at groups like Fatah, Yasser Arafat's organization. When they come about in the late 50s and early 60s, they're actually quite a weak organization within the Palestinian national movement. Just as my theory predicts, they're actually the group that initiates violence again and again to try to kind of shake things up, change the game, get more notoriety, move themselves up the internal hierarchical ladder of the movement, and yet you have the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, which many people think of as synonymous with Fatah today. They're one and the same. Back then, they were actually very vicious rivals for leadership of the movement. The PLO and other top groups crack down on Fatah, tell them you should stop using violence, this is going to pull us into a conflict with Israel we're not ready for, and ultimately, that does happen. Fatah's attacks helped to contribute to the start of the 67 war, which is ultimately a disaster for the Palestinian movement and the Palestinian people. You have more refugees created. The Israelis capture the West Bank and Gaza from Jordan and Egypt. And so ultimately, this is something that's negative for the Palestinian national movement. It's a failure. And a lot of the reason for that is because power inside the movement was fragmented. Also, though, as I say, the groups who are acting to use violence or not are, again, driven by their position in the national movement. Now, what's interesting is that a couple of years later, the hierarchy of the movement changes. So Fatah goes from being, the third or fourth strongest group to the strongest group in the movement. But nonetheless, it's still not a hegemon. So what happens is you have similar dynamics emerging, where you have a group initiating violence, this time against the Jordanian regime, and other groups in the Palestinian national movement trying to crack down and repress that violence. But now the groups have changed. Fatah is now the one who's repressing the violence and trying to stop it. The PFLP, the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine, previously a stronger organization, now weaker, is the one who's launching hijackings and other things, trying to shake things up, trying to launch a revolution against the King of Jordan. Again, though, the same thing happens. The Jordanian regime cracks down on the Palestinian national movement, what's called Black September. Ultimately, this is a disaster for the Palestinians. They get forced out of their best kind of military base on the border with Israel. But again, it's driven in part by the fact that there is fragmented power internally. The groups are competing with one another as much as they're competing with an external regime, and that leads to failure. Later on, when we get to the period of the mid-1980s to early 1990s, you finally have a hegemon within the Palestinian national movement. Fatah becomes the dominant group that has far more members, money, armament, status, etc., than any other group within the Palestinian national movement. Now, Fatah did not initiate the first Intifada, but after you have this kind of grassroots uprising in Gaza and the West Bank, Fatah is able to quickly get control of it, keep it from generally being a very violent uprising vis-a-vis the Israelis, and then put a lot of pressure, concerted pressure with a cohesive strategy on the Israelis that helps to yield recognition of the PLO and the Palestinians at Madrid and then the Oslo Accords. Doesn't ultimately get a state of Palestine, although that was part of the intention, but nonetheless they get more successes and more concessions for the Palestinians than they had gotten up until that point. So I argue that that case helps to demonstrate that, again, distribution of power plays a key role here. Within the Algerian national movement, just quickly, somewhat similar story. During the early periods of the movement, you have various wings. You have kind of the pragmatist moderate nationalist wing, you have the radical wing, you have the ulama, kind of some of the religious leaders, and again, they're not necessarily working with one another to achieve the state of Algeria. In the mid to late 1950s, what you start to see is the FLN, the National Liberation Front, comes to the fore and starts to dominate the movement. They don't do it kindly. They don't make a lot of nice deals and promise a lot of things to other groups. A lot of the time, they physically eliminate their rivals. So internally, there's a lot of infighting within the Algerian national movement. But ultimately, the FLN emerged dominant. And so when the French want to make some type of side deal and say, okay, maybe we'll give more autonomy to Algeria, but not full independence, they can't find a single group who will make that deal with them that can credibly, agree to end the war. The FLN's the only group they can make a deal with because it's so dominant. The FLN says, no, we want a state of Algeria. We want no dual citizenship for the French colonists who remain. We want all these other things, and they ultimately get pretty much everything they want because they're so dominant. So again, distribution of power is the key factor that drives movement success as well as group behavior.
What insights does your theory provide for the current insurgency in Syria, where it seems like every day there are new groups, shifting alliances, and significant violence?
Yeah, Syria is obviously a tragic story. Most reports now have about 150,000 people have been killed in that conflict, which, by the way, is more than the total number of people who have been killed in the Arab-Israeli conflict, which we think of course, as being a very brutal, long-lasting conflict. Syria has been incredibly deadly in the few years that there has been an insurgency. So I do think that my theory offers a couple insights. The first is that the whole idea of unity and trying to unify various autonomous groups and make them ally with one another isn't actually going to make a huge difference in terms of the outcome for the conflict. The United States, Turkey, a number of states on the side of kind of the rebels have tried to have these conferences where they get, 10 or 20 different groups to say, oh yeah, we're all going to work together now. What my argument finds and what my study finds is that makes no difference. Alliances among non-state groups are fleeting. They don't lead to changes in behavior. Whenever groups have their own personal or organizational incentive to do something different, they'll quickly leave the alliance. So what really does make a difference, again, is one group becoming dominant, either because it absorbs other groups into it, not making an alliance between two autonomous units, but literally absorbing it. So now it's just a single group with a single leadership, or one group literally becomes so strong because of funding that it gets, or it physically eliminates the other factions on the battlefield. If and when that happens, I think you can see or predict to see a much more successful insurgency against the Assad regime. Until that happens, I think it's very likely the Assad regime is going to maintain its position of power. It's going to be able to kind of divide and conquer conquer these groups. It's not going to face kind of a united or hegemonic front. And so in that sense, the U.S., to the extent it wants to help the rebels, should perhaps spend a little less time convening these kind of unity conferences and more trying to say, okay, who is kind of the best dog in this fight? Who is the group that we can put most of our faith in, and we feel like they can lead the movement, and then try to buck them up to get to the point that they can then face down the Assad regime and ultimately emerge victorious.
What is the impact of the recent Hamas and Fatah agreement?
The Hamas-Fatah unity agreement is something that did not come out of the blue in any sense. These groups have actually signed a number of deals over the past couple of years that were not implemented, and there's been a groundswell of popular support amongst the Palestinian people for many years trying to get these two groups to unify and work together again. But it's important to be clear what this unity deal is and is not. First, in terms of what it is not a deal that merges the organizations in any way. So it doesn't create a single hegemon of Fatah or Hamas. All the groups are saying is we agree to unite, quote unquote, within an electoral context. So we're going to potentially have elections in which we can compete with one another. To this point, they basically haven't been recognizing or having new elections. And so you have people like President Mahmoud Abbas, who's kind of overstayed the term that he was elected for. There's shots of delegitimacy from both sides saying that, this is not an elected body. So they've agreed first and foremost to actually have elections, which have not happened yet, but they say, in the agreement, this is something that we will do. Secondly, they say we're going to allow Hamas to join the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization. Now, that would be a change in the sense that, again, the PLO is not a single cohesive organization with a single leadership and every group within it does what that leadership says. It's kind of an umbrella group to which the groups pledge to work together, but there still are massive debates internally. Groups come and go from the PLO all the time historically. So even if Hamas joined the PLO, it wouldn't necessarily change the game in terms of the dynamics of the movement. I'd also say that I'm a bit skeptical about whether Hamas will join the PLO, only because since the early 1990s, Hamas has tried to join the PLO, and Fatah has tried to get Hamas to join the PLO, but on very different terms. The PLO from its onset was supposed to be an elected body, but for the vast majority of its history, it's actually had seats in the PLO be decided amongst bargains between the various groups. So basically, they get together, decide how strong they are comparatively, and then say, oh, I deserve 10 seats, I deserve 20 seats, you deserve 5 seats, based on their popular support, their resources, their membership, etc. So the sticking point has always been Hamas wants 40%, 50%, 60% of the seats, right? Because they don't want to join a group in which they're not going to at least have veto power, if not control. Fatah, of course, wants the other side. They want, oh, Hamas, please join the PLO with 20% of the seats. Then Fatah gets the legitimacy of having this major party inside of the group that they control, but they don't have to give up any of their control of how the PLO functions. So what I'm very interested to know is if Hamas is going to join the PLO, what is their seat total going to be? How much control are they going to have? As far as I've seen, the agreement has not made any of that public, if it's even been agreed to at all. So basically what's happened at this point is that the two parties have agreed to negotiate further. It's kind of like, to some extent, the Oslo Accords between Israel and the Palestinians. They both recognize the other side, but they leave all the final status issues to be discussed later and decided later. And we've seen in the Oslo context how that's been unsuccessful for over 20 years. So do I think there's some potential here for Hamas and Fatah to hold elections to move forward? Yes. But do I think that it's likely Hamas is necessarily going to join the PLO? Definitely some questions there. Even if ultimately all these things they intend to happen are agreed to, again, it only makes it so Hamas and Fatah will now compete for elections, and very quickly they'll still potentially be at each other's throats politically, just like political parties are. It doesn't necessarily make all of a sudden the Palestinians have a united front against the Israelis. On the Israeli side of things, they're upset about this because from Prime Minister Netanyahu's perspective, Hamas has not recognized Israel, agreed to give up terrorism from Israel's perspective, doesn't recognize previous agreements. So basically, Hamas hasn't done the things that Fatah did, 20 years ago to be able to have the Oslo Accords. So until that happens, it's unlikely the Israelis will negotiate with Hamas and with the PA, and the U.S. seems to be on the side of the Israelis in this case. So we'll see going forward, again, if this deal does happen. I think in part it's been done by Abbas to try to pressure the Israelis and show the Israelis and Netanyahu, hey, I have other options here. If we can't make this deal happen, I can go to the UN, I can turn towards Hamas, I can turn towards other donors and funders, and I'm not just going to be up a creek because we don't have a deal. So we'll see if this generates momentum towards, more negotiations with the Israelis, or ultimately this, opens a new day in the Palestinian national movement, and now we have these groups working together who for so long have been working apart.
What are the key takeaways and implications for policymakers from your article? What advice would you give to national movements? And how should the United States apply the lessons of your research?
Yeah, great. So, it totally depends if you're on the side of a national movement or you're working against a national movement. And honestly, my research offers prescriptions for both. So if you're on the side of a national movement, again, I would basically counsel to the extent possible, unity is better than fragmentation. So allying is better, various autonomous groups is better than non-allied autonomous groups. But at the end of the day, don't expect that to make a huge difference in your outcome. What really will make a difference is if you can somehow get behind a single dominant group that will lead the movement. Doesn't mean that there can't be other groups there that are, kind of comparatively weak. Doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that top group says and does. But if you have a hegemonic group, it's going to make it more likely that group will put in the effort, put in the resources to be successful. It'll give you clarity in signaling your demands and more credibility in delivering on them. It'll tamp down on the amount of internal infighting and ultimately, I think, make your movement more successful. Does that mean that there haven't been fragmented national movements have worked? No. There's been united ones, there have been fragmented ones. My research just looks at, though, and shows on average, hegemonic movements are more likely to be successful. So the extent you can push towards that, you're more likely to end up happy. Now, if you're a government and you're on the side of a movement, that's what you should try to do. If you're a government who's trying to combat a national movement, the key takeaways are actually different depending on, are you trying to prevent violence from the movement or are you trying to prevent the goals of the movement? Sometimes when we talk about counterinsurgency or counterterrorism from a state perspective, it's kind of like there's a single strategy that will be the best for everything. And my findings are that's actually not true. If you're trying to stop violence from a national movement, you should actually push for a hegemonic enemy, an enemy that has a single dominant group, because that's going to make it less likely that there's incentives for outbidding, for chain ganging, for these types of violent attacks that sometimes will target the state, even though it's driven for internal purposes. So you should actually be pushing for a hegemonic enemy if your goal is, counterterrorism or counterinsurgency in terms of fewer attacks and fewer deaths. However, if you are trying to prevent that national movement from being politically successful in terms of getting more autonomy or getting a new nation state, you should actually push for a divided or fragmented enemy, because then it's less likely to actually be able to clearly signal, to credibly guarantee, to use violence or put efforts towards that collective goal. Now, it'll be a more violent movement, there'll be more infighting, etc., but again, it'll be less cohesive in its strategy and so less likely to be effective against you in terms of achieving a state. So if you ultimately want to both prevent the movement from becoming a state and prevent violence, to some extent you're going to have to choose between those two, short and long term, because they don't call for the same strategy from the state's perspective.